Thank you so much for tuning into Journey with Christian D. Evans podcast. I'm your host, as always, Christian D. Evans. And guys, this next guest is an incredible guest, and that's why I'm so excited about having him on. We're going to be talking everything SaaS, small business to enterprise clients, how to structure that, how to convert it, how to scale, and the opportunities. Now, the reason why I'm having this guy on, he's sold 3 successful companies in Arizona, all in the SaaS world. His last company, Campus Logic, became one of the Arizona's fastest growing, largest, and well-funded software companies. He tried hard to build high-performing teams, category-defining products, and exclusive cultures. That's the reason why he takes a very hands-on approach to his portfolio companies. His current aspiration is to close the venture deficit in Arizona. He is using his capital, his connections, and operating experience to help ambitious software entrepreneurs build healthy, high-growth companies in Arizona. Please welcome my next guest, the one and only Gregg Scoresby. How are you today, Gregg?
Wow, what an intro. Thanks. I've been looking for a new hype man. I think I just found him. So thank you so much.
Here goes. Sign me up, man. Gregg, I'm looking forward to this conversation because like I mentioned, obviously a 3-time founder, B2B SaaS investor, and definitely as the managing partner of PHX Ventures. One of the things that I want to share with you and really ask and just jumping right into the deep end is when you look at this kind of business structure in the SaaS world, majority of SaaS kind of industries go to this kind of product market fit or this kind of product launch in more of a freemium membership kind of status. And then obviously getting a conversion later on down the path with, warm emails. I want to get your perspective on that. Do you believe that is a good fit for some companies? Or do you feel like that's not the best fit, definitely with a product launch?
Well, you're talking about specifically about the freemium model.
Yeah, freemium model, correct.
I think freemium model can be a great way to acquire customers. I will say, I definitely have a bias toward more paid upfront products, but part of that is if your product creates real value for someone, they should be willing to pay for it. But there's no question a freemium model can be a really powerful way to acquire customers. But I have not done a lot in the freemium world, but you do see that a lot, especially at lower end, either the SMB market or a consumer-oriented software product. You definitely see more of a freemium model where there's a set of features that someone will make available for free and then convert to a paid subscription. And all of us are probably users of many of those things like Notion or Monday.com or things like that that all have a freemium component. But I'm definitely more focused, and my career's been more focused on enterprise software. So longer sales cycle for sure, harder to acquire customers in that regard. But once you do, they have a little different dynamic there.
Well, I'm glad we kind of jumped into that because like you just mentioned, I see a lot of software that focus on that SMB, and that's that freemium model. And it is very interesting. I've seen some deal flow that it kind of structure that. And it's just interesting. Sometimes you got a lot of churn rate, definitely when you're working on that. And one of the reasons why I want to bring that up to you is just like you mentioned, you focus more on that enterprise B2B kind of world. And like you mentioned, there is this higher sales cycle with that. Sometimes you're talking, 6 months to, 8 months to maybe 12 months, depending upon what industry you're in. Gregg, when you're working that, how are you able to navigate that process to ensure that obviously you're optimizing the success, increasing the conversion rate, but also you want to make sure you decrease the churn rate on the back end for these companies?
Yeah, so I'll draw from my own experience at Campus Logic. We were an enterprise software company selling to colleges and universities. So there's a lot to figure out when you're selling to a college and university. You've got to have a fully baked security model. You've got to have bulletproof implementation model and plan, and be able to give these users control of the software like enterprise software. But they also need to be able to integrate to other subsystems, the student information system, in some cases, learning management system. So there's a lot there. I think what I always start with on the sales side, on the go-to-market side, no matter how long the sales cycle is, no matter what the annual contract value is or dynamic is, I really think that most of us as founders could get better at understanding what our buyers truly value and then connecting our value proposition to that. And I think most of us think we're pretty good at that. But at the end of the day, and I can give some examples of that, at the end of the day, people don't pay for stuff they don't value. And so if someone doesn't value what you've built or what they just won't keep paying for it. And so Often that's a product problem, or but it's something part of the value equation. It's just people don't pay for what they value. So happy to spend more time talking about some of the specifics of how I think you communicate value and how we did that at Campus Logic, and how I see companies we've invested in at Phoenix Ventures do that as well. But happy to go wherever you want to go in that conversation.
Yes, please. Let's jump into it because I want to give some context. I was talking to a software company that's doing about 3 million, 3.5 million top line. And one of the things, I come from more of a marketing world and background. And one of the things that I always notice, like a lot of SaaS, founders come into are very technical. These are the benefits, these are the features, and more of, like you just mentioned, the value. What is the problem that they're actually solving? Because through that kind of analysis, or that, bridging that gap, I've noticed it obviously is a direct impact to the churn as well as the lifetime value of those customers. So I'd love for you to just unpack that. What did you do? How did you get into that? And obviously really looking at it more of a micro level and saying, okay, hey, how do we really bridge that gap for these individuals to see the most value?
Well, Christian, I think your point is, I've seen that a lot of times, particularly with technical founders. I built something that I'm really proud of, that I love. I know the features inside and out, so I want to tell someone about those features. So I've definitely seen that pattern as well here. What I think we always want to start with is, who's the buyer and what is the job to be done for them, and like, what's the problem that they have, what's the thing that they need to solve, and how do I go deep on what really their job is. So in the context of my most recent company, Campus Logic, when you think about, we would sell to directors of financial aid and VPs of enrollment. And now, what is a VP? And usually, not always, but usually, the financial aid function would report up to the enrollment function. So budget was coming out of this enrollment function. An enrollment function in higher education is like the equivalent of a chief revenue officer role. I've got to get students in the door and do what it takes to get them in the door and in the seat to get their education. Then they go on to the academic side. So that includes finding students, telling them why our school's a great fit for you, helping them figure out how to pay for their education. Those are the jobs to be done. Those are the things that a VP of enrollment has to do. So we went deep on trying, and a director of financial aid is trying to figure out a really significant component of that. How do I figure out how to help a student understand the landscape for loans, grants, and scholarships to do that? So we would always start a conversation, even when at the very early days of Campus Logic, when there were founder-led sales, and that was the primary motion, was me selling. I would ask a VP of enrollment, do you ever lose students because the financial aid process is too hard? 100%, 100% of all VP enrollments in higher education in the US, there's 5,000 universities, would say yes. There's a bunch of financial friction. It's hard for students. It's hard for schools. And it's not because the financial aid office isn't great. It's because the process is inherently hard. There's multiple applications for different types of scholarships, for different types of loans, for different types of grants. And that's the way people pay for higher education in this country: loans, grants, and scholarships. And so when you start with a question that gets to the heart of what the buyer really cares about, what's the job they have to do, if you can understand that problem, it all starts with, like, what's the key question you have to ask to understand what they really value. So in follow up to that, when I would ask VPs of enrollment that, hey, do you ever lose students in this process? And everyone says yes, because it's really hard. I would kind of quickly follow up and say, if you make the financial aid process mobile, you make it simple, you make it personalized across loans, grants, and scholarships, you will enroll more students. The number one reason, our unique insight at Campus Logic was, the number one reason students don't enroll is not because they didn't find a school they love or they can't get in. It's the financial friction that they experience in the process. And so as we kind of understood what people valued and then communicated to them the value that we create, it really wasn't about features. It was about connecting, like, our value, our unique selling proposition, with the main job to be done that buyer has to do.
I think that's so brilliant how you were able to navigate that, but you also knew your customers and avatars so well at such a deep level. And so he's saying, hey, you know what? This is the problem you're facing. Wonderful. This can bridge the gap. You didn't get into all the details of all the structure and and there's probably a lot of good, amazing things that you had in there, but it was like, hey, you want this to solve? Hey, this is what solves that, issue, and so forth.
Well, and asking a VP of enrollment, like, do you want to enroll more students? Like, of course, the answer is yes. Like, this is the revenue line for colleges and universities. So it's like asking, head of sales, do you want to sell more? But I think, but quickly showing them the path. Hey, there's one barrier that's stopping you from enrolling more students. Our products will reduce those barriers, and you will enroll more students and retain more students in the long term.
So now my question is, working with so many founders in this area, okay, how do you help them navigate really focusing on that data and analytics aspect of maybe they're leveraging their current data or maybe their previous customers or their current customers, et cetera, to get the right data to ensure, okay, hey, how are we optimizing our product and our value up front to ensure that we're actually solving their core problem? How do you navigate that with these founders?
So, Phoenix Ventures is an early stage investor. So we're investing in seed stage companies, post revenue, usually a couple 100,000 in annual recurring revenue up to, a million, all B2B software. Um, in that phase, founder led sales should be the main thing. It doesn't mean they don't have a salesperson or two, but the founder should be the one spending the bulk of her or his time uh, leading selling. Like, it doesn't mean that they can be working on the product too, but they're going to be very involved in the sales process. I've noticed that the people who do that the best, it's, there's always been an orientation around, I need to do customer interviews so I can think about what features to build. But what I always try to figure out is, why does this founder understand why someone buys? It's not, and it's usually not about features. But so I think the data that they're already getting about what features to build, the best founders kind of filter that into really understanding what is the job to be done. And Clayton Christensen wrote the jobs to be done framework. If someone's got interest in, when I say job to be done, what does that mean? They can certainly go Google job to be done and learn more about that. But usually the data that people are already getting from doing customer discovery calls for product purposes, they have that data. They just need to go get that data. They need to think about the data differently and think, and kind of zoom out a little bit and think, what get in the mind of the buyer and think, what are they really trying to accomplish here? What is the thing that makes or breaks their job? And it's never a feature, right? It's never one feature. But getting to the essence of what someone needs to do. And usually founders have the data. They just haven't turned, like, the data into the message and into the process of how to engage with early buyers, because they need to be able to tell a customer, hey, I know your problem is X. If you buy my product, like, you will be able to do 2X. Like, you will be able to do more of this thing that you have to do if you have my product. And that has to be, certainly believable. But I think usually people have the data, but they've collected data for the purpose of building features. And what people need, what a lot of us early stage founders don't do, is bubble that up to, what's the job to be done, and how do I translate my feature set or my wish list into messaging that resonates.
Which makes sense. And so you're really looking at that kind of holistic picture. But like you said, you want to make sure when you're interpreting this data that it's not just going adding to more features and more code, et cetera. It's more of saying, hey, how are we going to leverage this in the value add? I want to ask you, because I experienced this when I was running and scaling my business. I remember so distinctively when at the beginning of my business to, later on when we were, running incredible top line, the avatar or the client adjusted and pivoted, right? And so as we optimized and saw better clients and so forth, and we started saying, okay, hey, who is our best clients? And I'm curious, what does that evolution look like? Because some of these companies that are doing 100, 200,000, ARR, they're doing great. However, though, from there to obviously when they're hitting, 100 million ARR, their client will, their avatar, excuse me, or their client will naturally evolve as well. So how does that conversation look like, and what kind of data are you looking at as you grow with the company and the client avatar?
Yeah, as you probably would expect, even though the job title might exist in the same way across company size, like, the context is just so different. I'll use my own experience here, right? If I'm head of enrollment at 1,000 student school, and our tuition is $50,000 a year, That's quite a bit different than 100,000 head of enrollment at 100,000 state institution where it's $15,000 a year. Like the dynamics are different, right? The size, the scale, one's private, one's public. And so they're never, even though these two people may have the same job title. So the persona of who you're selling to, it does change over time, but it's never, I think a lot of times founders want to think, hey, there's one persona that has this job title, when in fact the context really matters. And I say this all the time, but everything's contextual. Think about the context of the size of your customer, like where they are in their business, uh, what's the context in which they operate, what's the industry in which they operate, uh, and that can really vary. Those things can really vary widely. So I think you've got to over time you've got to probably build multiple uh, profiles here for persona. Uh, Starting with one is good. I see a lot of founders that have zero when we meet them. They haven't given enough thought to who the buyer is and what that buyer values. But I think over time, you just have to be more thoughtful about what messaging resonates and get better at discovery calls when you're doing early discovery and really get into the mind of that buyer. Really, the sales process has to mature in addition to the kind of marketing and messaging over time.
Is there a certain point? I remember, when we were doing about $5 million top line, every about 18 months, I would like to look at the data and the current like clients, as well as those that are like churning, and say, what are the similarities, right? And what are the differences? So then we're able to identify even further with the marketing, kind of what we need to do to make sure that we're attracting and leveraging the right people to us, that are the highest leverage, or excuse me, the highest paying clients for the less amount of time our team was spending on it and so forth. So I'm curious, diving deeper into this kind of same thing, like you just mentioned, is there a certain kind of evolution as you're kind of walking through this avatar and client, like you just mentioned? It is like, obviously, the more data, and I mean, you start with 10 clients, and then when you have 100 clients, you're able to figure out pretty quickly, okay, hey, who's taking most of our time, that's really kind of a pain in the butt, pain in the ass for my team, but they're really not spending that much money, right? Or they're not paying us that much. And so there are some that obviously are paying a lot, and they're easy, they're fun clients and so forth, and so you want more of those individuals. Did you ever look at that, with some of these founders, as well as even your own company, at those certain stages? And then my second question also is, when you do get to a certain point, I do know that you have to jump into different industries, right? Outside of maybe the industry that you're normally focused on. I think we saw HubSpot do this. We saw MailChimp do this. We saw some of these very well-known companies that did that kind of structure, and they had to pivot into these other verticals, and how that could be integrated into, XYZ business. So I'd love for your
Yeah.
perspective on that.
Well, so first of all, if I've got no revenue as a brand new company, just getting a product out into the wild here, what do I need? I need revenue. Like I need at bats. I need data, real live data on that. And so to some extent, as much as we want to talk about, um, you know, ideal customer profile, to some extent, it's really hard to say no to anything that's green, right? When someone's got their checkbook out and they're not perfect, and you're like, you know what, I really need revenue, all that. So it's not unusual to see customers churn after you get some level of scale. You go from 10 customers to 100. I never get too concerned by that if the founder and the team are data driven, right? Because if not everybody's data driven, but if somebody's data driven, you just describe your own process of, hey, I really want to go deep on every 12 to 18 months on this on the churn data and try to understand. And I think eventually that ends up starting to look like more like a quarterly exercise too, as you get to some point of scale. But I never really worry that much about a team who is very obsessed with data and taking data in about what's happening in the business and what they think is going to happen and making a new set of decisions. So I don't worry about being overly optimistic and the opportunistic in the early days. I do worry about that later on, where if someone keeps thinking, "Hey, all money is green. I just want to take money from any customer." Those businesses really struggle because that year churn just catches up to you. You can never and you also run out of early adopters. I mean, that's the thing you're looking for in the early days is like people willing to try something brand new. But just because you're willing to try something brand new does not mean you're the perfect customer profile. And so over time, I think you got to develop the discipline to say no to the wrong customers, and also be more targeted in your outbound and even your inbound kind of process here to make sure you're getting more of what the ideal customer profile actually looks like. So, but I think it starts with being data driven and intellectually honest about, look, we sold to these 10 customers and we're never going to do that again. I have had companies in our portfolio say, yeah, this isn't the ideal customer profile. That's why they churned. But in the next board meeting, they sold to the exact same customer again. And I was like, hey guys, you just said last board meeting this was not the ideal customer profile. Like, let's stop selling to them because we know that they're going to churn again here too. And so it's one thing to actually, and it's a good start to actually uh, get the data, do something with the data, acknowledge the data about churn, why people are churning. But it's another thing to change your approach with that data and have the discipline to say no to the things that, even though someone's got their money in their hand ready to pay you, you don't, not all money is green after you kind of scale a bit.
I appreciate your honesty, your very authentic honesty on that, because you're exactly right. When you just need the cash, you're like, hey, you know what? Give me your credit card, let's rock and roll. But then
Yeah.
at a certain point, you do obviously establish discipline because you're like, hey, you know what? We notice, these kind of businesses or these kind of individuals, they don't do as well for what we're doing. These tend to do a little bit better. I want to ask you this also. So this is what I always found so interesting about this kind of industry. Again, I'm not as well established in this industry as well as you are. But I've heard some incredible stories, incredible margins on this, and obviously that's one of the reasons why I want to have you on, because I wanted to obviously get an idea where you're thinking about, definitely these companies, enterprise clients, etc. There are some where, and to decrease the churn rate, you do have these enterprise clients because the sales cycle is so long that you want to make sure that there is some sort of contractual agreement of some sort, because then that kind of guarantees a good base of obviously 3, 6, 12 months, whatever that may be, of reoccurring revenue, et cetera, that you can kind of rely on during that time. But obviously, I think it's the perspective is that's not a bad thing as long as you're adding a lot of value to them as well. So I mean, let's just put that in perspective and let's just assume that there's a lot of value added into that. Greg, what is your perspective on having some sort of a contractual agreement for your service, et cetera?
Yeah, you mean you mean the trade off between having like a month to month contract versus long term contract?
Correct, correct. I've heard some where it's like enterprise, they allow just to get them to convert. It says, hey, you know what, you just try us out for whatever, and then next month you can obviously
Yeah.
quit whatever. That's a good and bad thing because then obviously that increases your possible churn rate, or also it could be something to get people in. So I just want to let you know,
Yeah.
ask you how you navigate the what does that look like, etc.
So it does depend on stage for me for sure, but I'm a pragmatist. I mean, look, think about this: if you have a long term contract and a customer hates you and hates your product and doesn't want to pay you for your product, do you really want to be the kind of company that holds someone hostage? That's going to kill your brand in the marketplace. So, just as a practical matter, one of the problems with long term contracts are, even though you could legally, you get a long term contract and you can hold someone hostage legally. Do you really want to do that? Do you really want to? Are you really going to sue your customer? Because everyone will know for collection, if you want to collect like money from your customer, everyone will know that you have a pattern of suing your customers. So I'm a little bit more, especially in the early days, I'm a little more of just a pragmatist. Like getting people to use your product and fall in love with your product is the goal. Later on, what I probably care about was less like locking people into contracts and more about administrative simplicity. So the reason I like long-term contracts is not so much because the payment's locked in, because as a practical matter, if somebody hates me and my product, I don't want to make them more mad by making them stuck in a contract. I want healthy, productive relationships. But it is an administrative hassle to go through renewals. So I am a big fan of getting paid up front annually if you can, if your customers' budgets support that, and making it easier for people to renew through the multi-year process here if they love your products. So I do think multi-year contracts, getting paid up front, are hugely valuable mechanisms in a software company, because the cash flow, the dynamic of getting paid up front and then not having to spend time renewing someone is really valuable. But I also want to overlay that with the practical side of, look, what are you going to do if somebody does hate your product? There are businesses too that I know quite well that and think about this, that have negative net promoter score, which means most people hate you, and very high retention because they feel kept hostage. I don't think that lasts in the long term. Like, people don't, but some of that happens to do, if you're like the core ERP and you have to use my product. You see this in higher education all the time, where I believe every student information system out there, like, nobody loves their student information system, but I have to use it to manage my grades, my academics, my enrollment. I have to use something to do that. But and a lot of people have customized that software. There's like old legacy software that's been highly customized, which makes it very expensive to maintain. And like, it's not, most of it's not really modern cloud software out there, and it does make it very hard to maintain, and that makes customers really frustrated, even though they're the ones who wanted to customize it. But they can't leave because it's too expensive to leave. So that's not even about long-term contracts. That's more about just, like, you want to build products that people love and want to stay with you no matter how long the contract is. So I'm always interested in the dynamic of net promoter score, retention, and just like, does someone love your product? Do they willingly renew? Like, that's the thing to get to, is, does someone willingly renew and love your product?
Yeah, because then you're adding so much value to those individuals and that stickiness of, just integrated into their life. I'm curious on this as well. This kind of, convection point where I remember when I think someone was telling me about this, where in order for Facebook to scale to that next level, and there was this one metric they focused on that produced all the other results. And they said, hey, if we can get a new individual on that could connect with 7 of their friends, the likeliness of them staying on the platform is extremely high. Now, and then of course that would increase ad spend, all that stuff, and ad, whatever. And so that's the same thing with Slack. They said, hey, if we can get a team to leverage this and send almost 32 messages within the team, their stickiness, the likeliness in the staying on is extremely high. And that was with every single company that I found so very interestingly. And so I always try to find that with any company that I'm working with or connecting with. And so I'm curious with you as well, when you're working with these enterprise clients, there's obviously that you have to bridge them, not only selling them, that's on the front end, but also now it's like, hey, how do we make sure that there's this proper handoff to the customer success team to make sure that this is integrated properly to actually solve that problem? Because now all of a sudden you're in with them, they're using it all the time, and the likeliness of them actually, quitting, like you just said, and deleting it is very, very low. Definitely if they're using it all the time. And so my question is bridging that gap, because that's the next level to make sure that there's that decrease of churn, and they don't churn, and that's how you scale to 100 million ARR, et cetera, et cetera. So what does that look like, making sure that there is that really beautiful handoff from the sales team to that customer success, and making sure that there's a proper integration for these enterprise clients?
Yeah, well, maybe two things on that. You mentioned, you use Facebook as an example. I do think whether you're doing SMB software, or like even consumer software, SMB or enterprise software, someone understanding what their North Star metric is, and if we have more of X, it's going to make everything else work in my business. I do think that's the right framing for someone to think about, what is the thing they have to do more of that makes everything else work in their business, and that's going to be different based on the context of the business. But I do think that matters. I mean, for us at Campus Logic, part of this was, we wanted to have integration to the student information system because it reduced friction for the student in the school. So the existence of integration was, you could use our products without integration, but integration is what made it very valuable, because it removed friction, removed data entry, and we were passing data back and forth between systems. So that was one thing we looked at, is the level of integrations. On your question though about the handoff, I think sometimes a lot of software companies optimize what's best for them, and there's an orientation around specialization. And I actually think we've overdone specialization. Again, this is also contextual, and this isn't universally true, but I think we've overdone specialization a little bit here. Like, so I've got an SDR that hands off to an AE, that hands off to maybe a post implementation kind of onboarding person that hands off to a customer success person, and then there's an account manager that comes in and does renewals and stuff. And that sucks from a customer standpoint, right? Like, it's terrible. Now, in reality, uh, the what's needed to be successful in an AE is really fundamentally different. I'm not suggesting that you have like an AE manage something all the way through, but I do think we can remove handoffs in the often, not always, but you can remove handoffs um, in the process. And sometimes on the customer implementation side, sometimes we create things on the customer success side because there are fundamental deficiencies in our products. And I think that's, again, getting back to intellectual honesty. If I have to have someone separate to manage support and all they do is take support calls, why are there so many support calls? It's probably because your product sucks, right?
Mm-hmm.
If your product was better and your product was like did what it said it was going to do and it was easier to use after something was up and running, there shouldn't be all that many support calls. And I don't know if you need a specialization. Like at Campus Logic, we didn't have dedicated support. We had dedicated customer success managers who could take support calls from the customers, from the named customers that they supported. And I had some customer success people who'd come from other industries say to me, "Hey, well, why don't we have a separate support desk?" And I was like, "Hey, you took 2 support calls last week from a customer. Like, I think you can handle 2 5-minute support calls a week from this customer. Like, this isn't a problem. I get that it's different than what you experienced before, but this isn't a problem." And by the way, you also in those support calls, you probably identified we might need to retrain this customer a little bit. Like, or the people that are using our product at this school, let's get some people to let's run a separate training session here because we want full adoption. We want people to love our products. And so you're learning things on these calls that have value for you. So I'm a big believer where possible. And I know it's not always possible, but I'm a big believer in what I call full stack customer success. So if you can have someone who implements the product and supports and manages it, if your product is conducive and your industry is conducive to that, I'm a big fan of that. That's not always possible. Sometimes products are so complex, they require a very high level of specialization to implement. And we had one of those products at Campus Logic where there was a lot of complexity on some of the things. We also had to build the integrations. We also had a separate piece there, but by and large, we tried to be full stack wherever we could. That requires a super high level of product knowledge, and it requires someone who's good at customer relationships, and someone has to want the best for these customers over a long period of time. But that's why we had such a high gross margin business, because we had like people who could manage all of these functions, and we always had north of 110% net revenue retention, in part because customers would buy more from us and like stay with us for a really long time. So I just think sometimes we optimize for that handoff in ways that work for us as a company, or because our product doesn't do something, instead of thinking about the customer journey and like what would be best for the customer from the time they sign the contract through the next 10 years they're going to be our customer.
Oh, I love what you said there because I see that all the time. I mean, you're talking 4 different people before you actually get, the service, et cetera, and whatever. And I just think that sales cycle on the front is just so interesting. So I'm glad you kind of talked about that. But also, it is so great to see where the net retention rate on the back end was for your company was just massive, just because I mean that experience throughout that whole process was just streamlined and simplified. I want to ask you this also. So as you were talking, I was thinking about, obviously specifically HubSpot. Um, when HubSpot went out there and created this amazing CRM, there was this, what I found very interesting, these companies that would come across and they would create a CRM, but it was specialized for a, industry. So for example, there was another one that branched off and became like $100 million top line business. And it was just mainly for investment bankers, right? CRM just for investment bankers, et cetera. And what I found so interesting is, someone mentioned the riches are in the niches, right? Where you're able to niche down and create a product specific for this, and this group of individuals. However, though, in order to scale to that next level, and I'm talking later stage where you want to, 100 million ARR, et cetera, you obviously have to branch outside of it, because at some point, either there's one way: you can either increase your prices, get new customers, or obviously upsell current customers more stuff, right? And that's really the three main ways of increasing revenue. My question is, when people are, at what point do you feel like is a good opportunity to say, okay, hey, we maxed out kind of this market, okay, whatever that market may be, name whatever that market is, right? Let's say, for example, campus, right? Universities. There's only a select amount of universities. Now all of a sudden you max that out. Now we got to pivot and maybe look at a different industry that can still save this, solve the same problems. Maybe high schoolers, maybe schools, maybe kind of that next level down, or maybe international clients. My question is, what does that look like? What is that conversation? And at what point, maybe a top line revenue, or is that more just an evolution? It's like sitting there saying, hey, you know what? We're at $50 million top line, $60 million. We've maximized every kind of metric possible. And then now we're deciding to kind of look at that. I know it's contextual depending upon each industry, as well as the numbers, et cetera, et cetera. But I'd love for you to just talk us
Yeah.
through that the way you thought about it, Greg.
So let me put on my early stage venture capital hat here. On one of the things I'm very interested in. I as an investor here, and I experienced this also in an operator role. Well, one of the things I think is way overstated is the need for like $1 billion plus TAM, right? Total addressable market. And because uh, these markets end up looking done correctly, and markets end up getting looking way bigger. So think about Viva Systems, like CRM for pharma here. Who would have thought there was such a huge public company profile? Who would have thought there was such a big opportunity for that, right? And so I think these end markets can end up becoming way bigger. What I'm more interested in when I'm looking at a company as a potential investment, I really want to know how the founder does the bottom up math for the market. I think this is just my personal opinion here, but I think the whole idea of TAM, SAM, and SOM, like these concentric circles that you see in pitch decks, is way overdone. Right? Total addressable market, serviceable addressable market, serviceable obtainable market. And what I'm more interested in is I want someone to say, "Hey, I've got this wedge with this product, and I've got traction in here with this product because customers love this feature set, and here's how I'm going to grow that market over time." I'm way more interested in that conversation because it helps me understand how the founder thinks about the future of her industry and how she sees this, like the market unfolding, and how she's going to launch product number two to grow the market here. So you kind of got to this, Christian, but I think there's ways to think about how do I go get adjacent markets. But there's also what's probably most interesting to me is how do I sell more product, new product, to the same buyer. If a buyer loves you, and you're solving a problem for them, they don't just have one problem in the world. Like they've got a lot of other problems that you could probably solve to do that. So at Campus Logic, I committed pretty early. I mean, we made a market. We were replacing labor, paper, pencil. We were a new line item on a budget in higher education, which is very hard to do. We were not replacing some other software product by and large. We were replacing, again, manual interactions between a student and a school. And so in my operating context, what I wanted to do was change the way the students engage with loans, grants, and scholarships. And I knew that was going to look like a big suite of products. So we launched a new product every year for 7 years. And that was, so I'm a big believer in product portfolio. If you can become great at building product, and that product was all going back to the same buyer, these end markets, because you sold more product, new product, not just raise price, but more and new product to the same buyer who already knows you and trusts you and has other problems you can solve. To me, that's a great way to grow the market. Now, of course, you can go outside the market and go get new buyers in other industries, and that's a good playbook as well. But I personally love a product portfolio orientation with going deep on understanding what this buyer needs and how do I make their life better with a suite of products.
Incredible, man. I just love the way you're sharing this information, the way you look at it, and the way you're thinking. It allows me to really understand how Greg thinks about this stuff from inception to basically the growth of a company and so forth. When we're looking at more of that kind of mid tier company, okay, And this is what I always found interesting when I was running my business is this kind of this balance act where it's like, okay, we got to keep margins, but we also got to grow. And so it's back and forth where you hire and then obviously your margins decrease. And so it's this back and forth. And so I'm curious, like we just mentioned, there's certain different tactics and strategies to ensure that you optimize as much as possible with your margins, right? Because it's attractive to investors, right? However, though, you also want to really grow at a very, high level and so forth. And my question is, what does that balance act look like for you? Is there a good healthy margin where it's like, hey, you know what, we're we're beyond 60%, that's okay. But if we drop down below 60%, now all of a sudden, right? Normally we like to stay around 70, 80% margins, et cetera, depending upon obviously what SaaS platform, what kind of structure it looks like. What does that balancing act look like for you as you evolve and scale a company?
Yeah, that I don't think there's any set answer, but I will say this: like, I worry the least about companies that we've invested in or not invested in. I worry the least about people that are at least having the conversation. If you're not a metric-driven founder, I'm pretty worried about you and your company, right? You got to at least engage honestly and in a detailed way with the math of your business. So if you don't understand what goes into the math of your business, that's going to be hard. So like just step one is actually measuring, monitoring, and being connected and obsessed with the math of your business. Because if you obsess about the math of your business, it's the way you make good decisions in the future. Like this is what, hey, we spent this much on customer acquisition last quarter, and only 35% of it was effective. So this other 65% we spent on was pretty much not efficient. And let's stop doing that. Like I'm less worried about someone who burns a little more than they thought they would because they tried something, but then they quickly pivot and change directions and pursue a channel that is more efficient. And so I'm a little less worried about that. I do think on the customer acquisition cost, and I know you were asking specifically about margins, but usually if in the software world, you don't see on gross margins anyway, you don't see a lot of volatility usually in gross margins. Gross margins get better with scale, but you don't necessarily see inferior. You don't see a lot of variability on the gross margin standpoint. You do see a lot of variability on because if I sell a piece of software that's easy to support and I sell it to 30 more people that look like that, the support dynamics are usually, not always, but somewhat similar. Hosting costs are pretty fixed, and that's above the line in cost of goods sold. And then also like my support customer success costs are above the line. And so gross margin usually is somewhat banded, even subscale. But like once you get to 1 million, 2 million in ARR, gross margin is like you should be able to increase it. And at Campus Logic for 7 years, I focused on adding at least 100 basis points, so at least 1% gross margin. So you can definitely improve gross margin as you grow and you scale and you get better. But where you see a lot of variability is actually in customer acquisition costs, because the way you spend money on acquiring customers changes, right? So I start with an inbound model, and then I realize, gosh, I'm getting a lot of traction in the dental industry, so I'm going to start going to the dental like trade shows. That's a different spend item, and so my customer acquisition cost might go up. And that was super efficient. I went to that trade show. I met a bunch of like dental service organizations that bought my software, and so that was super efficient channel. I want to do more of that and go across other things. But that experimentation that happens on the sales and marketing cost, that creates a lot of variability. So I'm always less worried about, and so I worry less about variability there. So if somebody spends way too much acquiring one new dollar of recurring revenue this quarter, but then they adjust next quarter because not necessarily to spend less, but to spend differently in a more effective way, I'm always less worried about someone like that keeps kind of trying to hit the same nail with like even an even bigger hammer over and over, but they just kind of can't get it in. So to me, it's less about, but there's always a balance. But I think it starts with being obsessed with the math of your business, and then having intellectually honest conversation with your team about, hey, what we're doing isn't working, and we need to make the math of our business work here. Let's try something different. I mean, those founders that do that and do that in rapid succession are usually successful if they can get into market, and those that don't usually die a slow and painful death.
Thank you, Greg, for that. A slow and painful death is what Greg says. Now, I appreciate what you're saying here because I want to double click on this because this is what I found so interesting. I remember so clearly when we were optimizing and we managed millions of dollars in ad spend specifically on all these different platforms. And I remember so specifically one day when I was looking at my own cost per call, and we were optimizing on all these campaigns our cost per call, and we want to make sure that obviously in order to acquire a customer, we were below about $200-300 cost per phone call, and anything below that was like, hey, that's fantastic. Then I started realizing, and I want to ask you on this, we actually realized that that was a vanity metric. And the reason why is because we leveraged then a system called Hyros, and Hyros was able to now then share with us what actual campaign is actually producing profit, what's creating revenue. And so now all of a sudden our head switched, our whole mindset switched. Instead of optimizing for a metric that we thought was very prevalent, now it's like, hey, which actual campaign is actually producing it? Because it may be the campaign that's maybe the cost per phone call is $250, but it's actually producing a lot of revenue. So I'm fine with turning that one on and keeping that one on. And so what I found so interesting about that was how the evolution of just knowing these metrics in certain things that, for founders that are beginning, and you've sold 3 companies. So I just remember my journey, and I remember I was focusing on that for a long time, and then I started realizing, well, shoot, what if I could have just focused on this for the last 6 months? How much more revenue could have we brought? Because we were turning off campaigns that were actually profitable. It really, really frustrated me. But again, it was a good learning lesson for myself. And I just remember distinctively that experience and making sure that whenever I advise companies or look at companies, et cetera, that I'm always very aware of that, making sure that there are certain vanity metrics that we love to measure, but that don't move the needle further at all, or we don't think it does, or maybe we think it does, but it doesn't. So I'd love for you to just talk a little bit about that. You've sold numerous companies. Obviously, from the first time to third time, it's totally drastically different, and you've learned tremendously. So, what were certain things that you looked at with vanity metrics that were like, "Hey, we should stop measuring this. We got to focus on this or X, Y, Z."
Well, two answers to that. One, I think you're exactly right, Christian. The way to think about, I don't know the context of your business here, but it is easy to think that this sum input metric is higher than I usually have seen before, so I need to turn off this campaign or something like that. I said I don't like the metric. When in fact that campaign has a higher close rate, so I could actually spend 3 times on this cost per phone call because it closes at a rate like that's 4 or 5 times higher than these other campaigns. So I think understanding, like looking at the inputs versus outputs, is really where that gets to. Like sometimes we get too focused on like one side of the equation or other. I'll tell you, one thing that drove me nuts in my own operating experience is one example is um, I do think that in some cases, people are way too focused on MQLs and SQLs, right? Marketing qualified lead or sales qualified lead. And in my own, again, this is contextual and this may not apply to all the listeners here, but I sometimes felt like my sales and marketing organization spent more time on their own attribution. Like our customer doesn't care whether this is an SQL, or an MQL, right? They don't care. And in fact, it doesn't necessarily whether you're measuring first attribution where we met this customer, did we meet them at an event, or was it the email from the sales rep that invited them to the event, or was it the email from the marketing person who invited them to the event that came that like what we don't need to optimize for, was this a marketing generated lead that marketing kind of qualified and handed off. And so what was a little bit unconventional in my own journey was I like, hey, let's get away from that altogether. Here's what I care about. I care about pipeline creation, regardless of where it came from. And so I'm going to measure both these teams on just pipeline creation here. And we are going to talk about what's working and what's not working. And we're going to agree on our sales and marketing team uh, on what's working and what's not working. But we're not going to spend time on debating whether something it was attributable to a sales effort or marketing effort, because like it ended up being more about taking credit for something than it was about learning from that. And so I do think that there is such a thing as measuring too much. So once we got rid of that measurement, I found that we got more efficient and we actually started having more of a conversation around, hey, well, what campaigns do you want to run, and why do you want to run these, and how should we run these campaigns, and what events do we want to attend, and like what kind of content should we be producing to connect with our customers here. So I think sometimes getting rid of certain measurements that create internal conflict is probably the right thing to do. At least that was my experience. And then how do I how do I focus on metrics that align rather than divide? That was, so as a founder and CEO, that was always a challenge for me, is how do I change the measurement to create, because smart, capable people, if you hire smart, capable, hardworking people, everybody wants to do a good job, right? And everybody wants to do a good job in part by telling you, hey, Christian, here's what my team accomplished last month, and here's the metric, right? And so, but sometimes that can be divisive, done, taken out of context. So I always wanted a metric that forced collaboration and forced, like, let's solve the same problem together. And so for me, that was moving from MQLs and SQLs to just like, hey, let's just look at aggregate pipeline generation and what worked and what didn't work, regardless of what we attributed it to. That was really in one chapter of my own experience here. That ended up being a really constructive, approach.
For the team internally to be able to, have that synergy, which is very interesting that you mentioned that. I want to ask because I was thinking about this. I remember specifically, the churn rate. And just speaking on this, because I always found this interesting as well, like data points and so forth, because it tells a story and you got to look at deeper into it in context a little bit. And everything is context. And I remember when I was looking at one of these companies and the monthly churn rate, et cetera, and one was like 50% churn rate. But you have to put this in context. They only had two clients that were renewing, and one didn't, and one did. And so it was like, guys, you can't really, you got to put that into context. You really can't just put 50% on that. But have you done that as well, where you've seen certain things where there is some like outlandish number, and it's like, okay, wait, we got to put this into structure. Definitely working with investors, because that's very, very top of mind for a lot of investors.
Yeah, I think two things: small sample sizes are not helpful, right? They don't allow you to extrapolate. So that example certainly is one. I also think sometimes people want to hold up, and this gets back to our previous point about a vanity metric too. People want to hold out one metric, but look, you either hit your quarterly bookings number, or you didn't. Like, you either got, grew the business, or you didn't here. And so you don't get to pick one metric that looks good and then tell your board of directors or tell future investors about how great this one metric looks like, when in fact the everything else doesn't look so good in the business here. So I will tell you in general, and this might not be exactly what you're asking, but as an investor, putting my investor hat on, the thing that makes me trust a founder more is when I ask him, hey, what's going well in the business, and he tells me, this is what I'm really proud of, and then he said, before I can even ask, let me tell you what's really bugging me in my business. Like, people who are building real companies, there is always something that ticks you off about your business. Like, there's always something broken. 100% of the time in all my companies, there was always some fire burning, and there was always something to fix. And like, if you're growing a lot, there's always going to be something broken. And so I trust a founder more who tells me, like, this thing's not working and I got to fix this. This is the next thing for me to fix. I don't hear that and think, oh, there's something broken. I hear that and think, here's a founder who's in the math of their business. They are like grinding, and like, they know what isn't working and they will fix it. So if, be transparent, I would say to anybody thinking about what to measure, how to, what to share and what not to share, transparency with confidence and focus here. You can't say, I don't know what to do. Like, that doesn't breed confidence or trust. But early stage investors understand stuff breaks, and it's broken all the time. And if you want someone to trust you more, be transparent.
Oh, I love that. Definitely in today's world where, there's a lot of, smoking face, if you will, whatever the saying is. There's a lot of that. So I appreciate just being transparent and authentic with your investors as well as your founders. I want to pivot for these last few minutes talking about the exit. Okay, we've had a lot of investors on that talk about their exit, and really, at a micro level, we've had a lot of listeners as well that are just always intrigued to how to navigate this. Definitely in this kind of economy, but I mean, regardless or up or down, I mean, at the end of the day, it's how do you exit? What does that look like, and how to navigate that? There are certain where it's more strategic, exit, where it's like, hey, you're working with someone, you still own it, and then you still want to just work with a private equity firm that's able to, scale, or a big investor or whatever that's able to help you, take some chips off the table. There's others where it's that earnout. There's others that, and I don't want to talk obviously more of micro because you may or may not be able to share that, but I really want to ask you more about how you thought about each exit. What did you think about and saying, hey, you know what, this is what I want to navigate. This is how I want to structure this. And again, we don't have to get too much in the micro. You probably won't be able to share that, but it's just more of how you thought about each exit. Okay.
Well, let me share the most. So on the first one, first company I sold, we hadn't raised very much money. I had been this was 20 years ago. I've been at a startup that failed, and it was hard. And then I left and went and started my own company, and I didn't raise very much capital, and we had an early exit. And I exited the company in like 2006. That it wasn't like never work again money or anything like that, but it was meaningful to me. And and honestly, I had one group interested in buying. The price seemed fair. I was in my 30s and early 30s, and it seemed like I'd come off of something that didn't work, and it seemed like it made sense to do, and I was really glad I did it. I had an earnout for a couple of years, maxed out the earnout, and then moved on, and it was good. It was good and constructive. The most recent one was a little different because so I had one investor in that first company 20 years ago, and there was one strategic investor who invested like 300,000, less than $300,000. That was the only outside capital we'd taken. So it was a very different dynamic. I owned a significant percentage of the company. The last company, Campus Logic, we raised a lot of money. But one of the reasons we raised a lot of money, we were building a very complex product. We scaled to 800 colleges, universities. We had customers ranging from like 40 to 50K in annual contract value, up to $500,000 in annual contract value. So much different profile. We were approaching 50 million in annual recurring revenue, and also along the way in 2018, I did a majority recap with JMI Equity. They're a wonderful B2B software, premier B2B software investor, and they were great partners for me. So I had literally had 55 investors on the cap table. Before then, it was a really messy cap table, and after that, we had two, me and JMI, and they were great partners. I loved working with them, and so that was a totally different path that I had taken, and but recapped with them in 2018. I did the same thing 2 years later in 2020, with a significant increase in valuation, and with Dragoneer Investment Group. Again, great investors. Interestingly, principals from both of those firms are now investors in my fund. So it's been which is always a good signal that things worked out. But 2 years later, after we did the deal with Dragoneer, not even 2 years later, one of the things that happened was there was a Blackstone and Vista bought a company, Ellucian, large student information system, great company. They have 60% market share in higher ed. Company we've been partners with at Campus Logic for years, but that they did a deal in in the market. They bought that company, and I knew, and they made some public comments about we're going to go do a bunch of acquisitions, and I'd known that company for a long time. I knew we were a perfect fit for that company, and so I went to the board and I said, look, these guys are going to start kind of consolidating this market. We should probably be open to considering an offer from them if they show up. And sure enough, they closed the deal, and they closed their deal with Blackstone and Vista closed the deal with Ellucian in September of 2021, and 90 days later, they bought my company. Like, so it was like literally that quick. So sometimes there's just industry dynamics that are going on, plus the context of how much you've raised, who have you raised it from, and like what your investors want, what you want in your life here. And so those are the things that, it all starts with being in touch with what's going into the market, what's going on in your business, and like what's the right thing for everybody around the table. And I think if you can understand that and constantly kind of take your temperature on that, you just don't know what markets are going to look like. So I think having flexibility for when you want to do an exit, it starts with that. But always, so I'm kind of always in the market, um, monitoring what's going on. But I want to have flexibility with respect to, like, maybe we'll sell next year, maybe we'll sell 5 years from now. I don't know. But that was kind of my mindset. That's worked really well for me, is flexibility on the timeline, but total connection with what's happening in the market at any point in time.
Ooh, I like that. So you're really just bringing everything into context, and then also, like you said, just being flexible, just being very transparent with that. When you're looking at this, these exits in the second and third one there specifically, were you looking for someone to, to sell this to, or was it more of just kind of a evolution of a, hey, we're looking for this, that conversation kind of evolved, and then of course you're like, hey, you know what, this the right price, et cetera, the second and third one specifically.
Well, on the Campus Logic transaction, we hired a banker because we engaged Goldman Sachs in part because I knew there would be a ton of people around the table. It's
Mhm.
also very hard in the context of having a private equity running a private equity backed company or venture backed company. You kind of need to hire a banker if you're committed to exit here, because a banker puts discipline on the process and there's real price discovery. It's very
Mhm.
hard for institutional investors to be willing to sell a company if you haven't made a market. So in that particular case, I knew there would be a transaction to do because of some of the things happening in the market, like I mentioned. I also thought that like the company who bought us, I did think they would be the one who I didn't know that they would, but I thought they should be willing. It was made the most strategic sense for them to do it. But I but we in that case we hired a banker, and we ended up getting 12 offers. Which is great to have. Now, keep in mind this was 2021, so it's a little different era than maybe it is today. But that was, and then we worked through a process and kind of whittled that down to like 5 or 6, and whittled that down to 3 or 4, and then we had the last two at the end, and we the structure was right, the relationship was right, it was the right home for the asset. I thought it would be great for our customers and our employees, and so those are the things that we went through in that process. But I don't think you need to hire a banker all the time. I don't. I mean, certainly my first company and second company, we didn't do that. But in the context of running the venture and private equity backed company, you probably need to hire a banker if you're going to sell the company here, to put discipline on the process, and like for real price discovery, you have to do that.
Oh, that makes sense, man. Greg, I really appreciate being on here, man. Just talking, everything SaaS. This has just been a great conversation, really unpacking and looking at the hood, or unpacking the hood, if you will. Totally got that whole that saying wrong. But the thing is, Greg, is I really appreciate being on here and sharing this, because it's just so powerful. Really, what's going on in the SaaS world, how you navigate that with, from inception to the startup to, obviously scaling and a very high level, and just those incremental things that you can bring to a lot of founders, and really, working with very closely with them, but also talking about your exits. I have so many other just follow-up questions, but I want to respect our time together. I really appreciate you being on here. For those that want to reach out to you, maybe just partner, maybe just learn a little bit more, follow you with your journey as well, Greg, how do they reach out to you, my man?
LinkedIn's always the best, but I will say if you want to build a B2B SaaS software company in Arizona, or you're building one today, please reach out to me on LinkedIn. Like I'm all B2B SaaS, all Arizona, all the time. So we're early stage investors, but we're actively investing in deploying. We've been the most active investor and software investor in Arizona the last few years, and continue to want to do that. But LinkedIn's always best, and would love to learn more about your company. You can also go to our website, phxventures.com. It's phoenixventures.com. And you're welcome to even put a pitch deck on there and submit it. I look at everything that comes through there, but we'd love to certainly meet anybody who's building a B2B software company early stage in Arizona.
And they've also got a really cool podcast that they just kind of start launching. So I'll put all those links in the description to make it
Yeah,
very
thank you.
simple. So you can guys reach out to Greg there, and totally recommend it because he's on the forefront of this and just really helping build this amazing ecosystem, specifically in Arizona, but also throughout the United States. Greg, I really appreciate you being on here, guys. That is my friend, the one and only three-time founder, B2B SaaS investor, and managing partner at PHX Ventures, the one and only Gregg Scoresby. Guys, that is Journey with Christian D. Evans podcast. Until next time, be uncommon if you can.